Zexthon received the assignment on a cold morning aboard the Council station orbiting Nexus Prime, the message appearing on his datapad while he sipped his morning nutrition blend and watched cargo ships drift past the observation deck like slow metal birds against the stars, their running lights blinking in patterns that had become as familiar to him as breathing after 20 cycles of military intelligence work for the Galactic Council. The mission brief was simple enough that even a junior analyst could handle it, which made Zexthon wonder why they had chosen him specifically for this particular task when dozens of other observers were available and eager for field assignments. But he dismissed the thought as quickly as it came, because questioning Council decisions was not part of his job description and never led anywhere productive anyway. According to the files, a species called humans had recently been discovered on the Outer Rim territories, where the Council's influence was thin and unreliable. And these humans were now engaged in armed conflict with the Korth Empire, a well-known aggressive faction that had been expanding their territory through conquest and intimidation for the past 50 standard years without much resistance from anyone. The Korth were experienced warriors with advanced technology and a proven track record of overwhelming smaller civilizations. So the Council expected this conflict to be brief and decisive, lasting perhaps a few weeks at most before the humans either surrendered or were completely destroyed, which would provide valuable data about both species' military capabilities without requiring any direct Council intervention. Zexthon's role was to observe and document the battles from a safe distance using his cloaked scout ship, recording tactical information about weapons, ship designs, combat strategies, and psychological factors that might be useful for future Council operations in that sector of space, where monitoring was always challenging due to the vast distances involved. The journey to the conflict zone took 12 days through hyperspace, lanes that became increasingly sparse and poorly maintained as he traveled further from civilized space, passing through systems where ancient automated beacons still functioned, but no living beings had been seen for generations, their planets either empty or inhabited by primitive species that had not yet developed space travel. When Zexthon finally emerged from hyperspace at the coordinates specified in his mission brief, the first thing he noticed was how small the human ships appeared compared to the massive Korth dreadnoughts that dominated the battlefield, like floating cities bristling with weapon arrays, their hulls scarred and blackened from recent combat, but still maintaining perfect formation as they advanced toward the human defensive line. The human vessels looked almost fragile by comparison, their sleek designs suggesting speed rather than durability, and many showed obvious signs of hasty repairs with mismatched hull plating and jury-rigged weapon mounts that spoke of a species working with limited resources and manufacturing capabilities. Yet they held their position despite being clearly outgunned and outnumbered. Zexthon activated his recording equipment and settled into his observation post, expecting to witness a quick demonstration of Korth military superiority, followed by either human surrender or complete annihilation. But what he saw instead made him recalibrate his instruments twice because the readings seemed impossible. The human fleet was commanded by someone called Jake Morrison, according to the communications. Intercepts Zexthon's equipment decoded, and this Morrison person was issuing orders with a calm confidence that seemed completely at odds with his tactical situation, discussing attack patterns and defensive formations as if he actually believed his smaller force could achieve something meaningful against the Korth armada. Even more puzzling were the human responses to Morrison's commands, filled with what Zexthon's translation protocols identified as humor and casual references that suggested these beings were actually enjoying themselves despite facing almost certain death, laughing about things like whose turn it was to buy drinks after the battle as if survival was a foregone conclusion rather than a remote possibility. The communications chatter revealed names like Lisa Rodriguez commanding something called Swift Strike, Danny Martinez leading ground forces on a nearby planet, and Amy Foster running engineering operations across multiple ships, all of them responding to orders with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness rather than the grim resignation ZX Thon would have expected from any rational species facing such overwhelming odds. As he monitored the human fleet's movements and weapon signatures, Zexthan began to compile his initial report for the Council, noting the humans' apparent technological disadvantage and numerical inferiority while documenting their unusual psychological profile that seemed to lack proper fear responses or realistic threat assessment capabilities. The Korth forces began their attack run exactly as Zexthan had predicted, their massive ships moving forward in a standard intimidation formation designed to convince enemies to surrender before actual combat became necessary, but the humans responded by accelerating toward the advancing fleet rather than away from it, which made no tactical sense whatsoever. Zexthan checked his instruments again and confirmed that yes, the humans were actually charging directly at ships that outmassed them by factors of 10 or more. Their communication channels filled with what his translation software could only describe as battle cries and expressions of excitement rather than desperation or panic. This was going to be even more brief than he had anticipated, Zexthan thought, as he adjusted his recording parameters to capture what would undoubtedly be a very one-sided engagement between a professional military force and what appeared to be an entire species suffering from some form of collective mental disorder that prevented them from recognizing obvious death when it approached. The first exchange of weapons fire confirmed everything Zexthan had expected about this conflict, with Korth plasma cannons tearing through human hull plating like it was made of paper, while the humans' return fire barely scratched the armored surfaces of the larger ships, creating bright flashes that dissipated harmlessly against energy shields that had been tested against much more sophisticated weapons than anything these primitives could produce. 3 human vessels were destroyed in the opening minutes of combat, their hulls cracking open like eggs to spill atmosphere and debris into the void, while their crews died in the cold vacuum of space. Yet the remaining ships continued their advance, without even pausing to recover survivors or reassess their obviously hopeless situations, then documented the tactical errors he observed, noting how the humans seemed to lack basic understanding of engagement ranges and defensive positioning, flying their ships directly into the most dangerous zones where Korth weapons could achieve maximum effectiveness, rather than using hit-and-run tactics that might have allowed them to survive longer than a few minutes. But then something happened that made Zexthan lean forward in his observation chair and replay the sensor data to make sure his equipment was functioning properly, because what he saw defied every principle of military logic he had learned during his years of studying galactic conflicts. Lisa Rodriguez, commanding the corvette Swift Strike, was leading her damaged ship on what appeared to be a suicide run against a Korth battlecruiser that was easily 20 times her vessel's mass, her hull breached in multiple places and life support systems failing according to the emergency signals Zexthan's sensors detected. Yet she was accelerating rather than retreating. Her communications with other human ships revealed that her main engines were offline, and her weapon systems were down to emergency power, leaving her essentially defenseless against the massive Korth vessel that was already turning its primary batteries toward her position. But instead of ejecting in escape pods or signaling surrender, Rodriguez was ordering her crew to redirect all remaining power to the ship's structural integrity. Field Zexthan watched in fascination as the crippled human ship continued its approach, despite taking continuous fire from multiple Korth weapons, its hull glowing red-hot from energy impacts, while pieces of armor plating were torn away by each successive hit. Yet somehow, Rodriguez kept her vessel moving forward on what he now realized was a carefully calculated intercept course. The transmission from Swift Strike was unlike anything in Zexthan's database of military communications. Rodriguez's voice, calm and steady as she spoke to someone she called Morrison, about making sure her crew's families would receive proper death benefits, followed by what his translation software identified as traditional human farewell expressions, mixed with words that seemed to be directed at the Korth forces ahead. Then Rodriguez did something that would haunt ZX Thon's reports for cycles to come, redirecting her ship's emergency power to the engines for one final burst of acceleration that sent the swift strike straight into the Korth battlecruiser's main reactor housing at a significant fraction of light speed. The resulting explosion visible across half the star system as both ships vanished in a brilliant flash of released energy. The shock wave from the collision disrupted the entire Korth formation, sending the massive dreadnoughts tumbling out of position while their shields flickered and failed under the electromagnetic pulse generated by the destroyed reactor, creating gaps in their defensive line that had not existed moments before. Before Zekastan could fully process what he had witnessed, the remaining human ships were already moving to exploit the chaos Rodriguez had created, diving through the disrupted Korth formation with their weapons blazing while the enemy vessels struggled to restore power and re-establish their tactical positions. Commander Morrison's voice echoed across the human fleet channels, calling Rodriguez's action a textbook example of what he termed breakthrough tactics, as if deliberately ramming a ship 20 times your size was something these beings practiced regularly rather than an act of desperate madness that should have resulted in nothing but pointless death. The humans fought with renewed intensity after Swift Strike's sacrifice, their weapons finding targets among the disoriented Korth ships, while their pilots executed maneuvers that seemed designed to maximize damage rather than preserve their own lives, diving close enough to enemy hulls that defensive batteries could not track them effectively. Zaxex then realized he was witnessing something his training had never prepared him for. A species that treated the death of their comrades not as a reason for caution or retreat, but as motivation for increased aggression. Each destroyed human ship seeming to make the survivors more dangerous, rather than more demoralized. The battle continued for several more hours, with the humans gradually wearing down the Korth forces through tactics that should not have worked, using their smaller ship's speed and maneuverability to stay inside the effective range of enemy point defense systems while targeting critical components, rather than attempting to destroy the massive vessels outright. When the Korth fleet finally withdrew from the engagement zone, they left behind 2 destroyed dreadnoughts and several crippled cruisers, losses that represented a significant portion of their local force strength and far exceeded what any reasonable military analysis would have predicted given the initial tactical situation. Yex then sat in his cloaked ship, staring at the debris field where Swift Strike had made its final stand, trying to understand what he had just observed and how he was going to explain it in his report to the Council, because everything he thought he knew about warfare and military psychology had just been turned completely upside down by a species that seemed to regard death as just another weapon in their arsenal. Over the following weeks, Zex Thon followed the conflict across multiple star systems and witnessed battle after battle that challenged everything he understood about military strategy and species behavior, watching human forces engage Korth armies in situations where surrender would have been not just reasonable, but the only logical choice for any sane civilization. The ground combat on Kepler-7 was particularly instructive, where Marine Colonel Danny Martinez led assault troops against fortified Korth positions that should have been impregnable according to standard tactical doctrine. Yet somehow, the humans found ways to breach defenses that had held against far superior forces. In previous campaigns, Martinez used terrain features in ways that Zixthon had never seen documented in any military textbook, turning natural rock formations into improvised artillery positions and using underground water channels as concealed approach routes that allowed his troops to appear behind enemy lines without triggering perimeter sensors. But what disturbed Zixthon most was not the tactical innovation itself, but the casual way Martinez discussed these maneuvers with his subordinates, as if turning every environmental feature into a potential weapon was something humans did instinctively, rather than a skill that required years of specialized training. The humans demonstrated an alarming ability to adapt their technology in real time during active combat situations, with engineers like Lieutenant Amy Foster somehow managing to reconfigure weapon systems and power distribution networks while under direct fire from Korth forces, using salvaged components from destroyed equipment to create new solutions that should not have been possible. When Korth energy shields proved effective against human plasma weapons, Foster's engineering teams began constructing kinetic projectile systems using materials scavenged from battle debris, turning pieces of destroyed spacecraft into high-velocity ammunition that could penetrate barriers designed to stop sophisticated energy attacks. Sex then watched Foster work from his concealed observation post during the siege of Station Omega, where she spent 18 continuous hours rewiring power conduits while Korth artillery bombardment shook the facility's superstructure, never once leaving her post despite repeated near misses that should have sent any rational being scrambling for safety. The most unsettling aspect of human behavior was their apparent inability to abandon wounded comrades, even when tactical doctrine clearly indicated that evacuation attempts would result in additional casualties without any meaningful chance of success. Dr. Peter Hayes exemplified this phenomenon during the battle for New Geneva, continuing to treat injured soldiers in a field hospital that was under constant bombardment from Korth orbital weapons, refusing evacuation orders from his superiors because there were still patients who could not be moved safely. Sachs then observed Hayes working in conditions that would have been challenging for a fully equipped medical facility, performing surgery with improvised tools, while the building around him gradually collapsed from repeated weapon impacts, yet somehow managing to save lives that any reasonable triage protocol would have classified as hopeless cases. This pattern of self-sacrifice for the benefit of others appeared throughout every level of human military organization, creating unit cohesion that seemed to violate basic principles of individual survival instinct that drove behavior in every other species. ZX Than had studied during his career squad, leaders routinely exposed themselves to enemy fire to provide, covering positions for their troops. Ship captains stayed at their posts during critical system failures that would have killed them rather than abandoning their crews. And even support personnel like mechanics and communications operators continued working at their stations while battles raged around them. The humans fought as if the concept of acceptable losses simply did not exist in their vocabulary, treating each individual life as irreplaceable regardless of tactical considerations or strategic objectives, which should have made them vulnerable to enemies who understood the mathematics of warfare. Instead, this apparent weakness somehow became a source of strength that multiplied their combat effectiveness beyond what their technology and numbers should have allowed, because every human soldier knew with absolute certainty that their comrades would never abandon them no matter how desperate the situation became. Yix then began to understand that human military doctrine was not based on the cost-benefit analysis that drove most galactic civilizations, but on principles that his translation software could only approximate as honor, loyalty, and duty, concepts that seemed to override basic survival programming. During the defense of Colony Beta, he watched human forces hold positions that were clearly untenable from a strategic perspective, not because they expected to win, but because evacuation would have meant abandoning civilian populations to Korth occupation forces. The defenders knew they were going to die, their communications channels filled with farewell messages to families and loved ones. Yet they continued, fighting with the same intensity they had shown in battles where victory was possible, as if the outcome was less important than the act of resistance itself. Commander Jake Morrison's tactical briefings revealed a species that approached warfare not as a problem to be solved efficiently, but as a test of character that determined who they were as individuals and as a civilization, measuring success by standards that had nothing to do with traditional military objectives. When Korth forces offered surrender terms that would have preserved human lives in exchange for territorial concessions, Morrison's response was broadcast across all frequencies, so the enemy could hear it clearly, stating that humans would rather die fighting than live under occupation, regardless of how reasonable the terms might appear to outside observers. Yitzhak realized he was documenting something unprecedented in galactic military history, a species that treated warfare as a form of existential expression rather than simply another method for achieving political goals, fighting not just to win, but to demonstrate that some things were worth dying for. The turning point in the war came when Admiral Kate Sullivan proposed a strategy that ZXTHON's tactical analysis software immediately classified as impossible, requiring coordination across 17 different star systems with timing precision that exceeded the capabilities of most galactic civilizations' military networks. Yet somehow the humans began implementing it anyway. Sullivan's plan involved using human ships not just as weapons platforms, but as communication relays and sensor networks, creating a distributed command structure that could function even if individual nodes were destroyed, which meant that losing ships would actually strengthen the overall system rather than weaken it as conventional military logic would predict. Strategy required precise timing across distances where normal communication delays would make coordination impossible. But the humans solved this problem by having ship crews volunteer for missions with 0% survival probability, positioning themselves at critical relay points, knowing they would be destroyed the moment Korth forces detected their presence. Zexton watched in growing alarm as human vessels moved into position throughout the sector, their crews making final preparations while joking about things like who owed money to whom, and whether the mess hall on Station Alpha would still be serving that terrible synthetic coffee when they got back, as if they were discussing a routine training exercise rather than their own certain deaths. Lieutenant Ryan Clark volunteered to pilot his damaged interceptor on a mission that even the humans acknowledged was suicide, flying directly into the reactor core of a Korth command ship to disable their fleet coordination systems at the exact moment when other human forces would be launching their coordinated attack. Clark's fighter was already severely damaged from previous engagements, held together with emergency repairs and operating on backup power systems that could fail at any moment. Yet he insisted he was the only pilot qualified for the mission because his navigation computer was the only one calibrated for the specific approach vector required. The interceptor's weapons were offline and its life support was functioning at minimal levels, meaning Clark would be flying blind through the most heavily defended section of the Korth fleet with no way to defend himself and no possibility of escape once he began his attack run. But his communications with other pilots revealed no fear or hesitation about the assignment. ZX then recorded Clark's final transmission to the human fleet, which began with tactical information about Korth defensive positions and ended with personal messages for his family, including a request that someone tell his wife he had taken several enemy ships with him and instructions about where to find insurance documents hidden in their kitchen. The young pilot's approach to certain death was so casual that ZXTHON initially thought his translation software was malfunctioning, because Clark seemed to be treating his suicide mission as just another job that needed to be completed rather than a heroic sacrifice that would save thousands of lives. When Clark's interceptor finally penetrated the Korth command ship's defensive perimeter and disappeared into the massive vessel's superstructure, the resulting explosion was visible across half the star system as the ship's main reactor went critical, sending cascading energy discharges through the entire Korth fleet formation. The destruction of the command ship triggered the coordinated human attack that Sullivan had planned, with forces appearing simultaneously across 17 different systems to strike at Korth supply lines, communication networks, and strategic installations, while their enemies struggled to re-establish command and control. What should have been a desperate last stand by an outgunned human force became a carefully orchestrated campaign that crippled Korth military capabilities throughout the entire sector, turning their previous advantages in numbers and technology into liabilities as their scattered forces could no longer coordinate effectively. Zekik then realized he was witnessing something that would fundamentally change how the Galactic Council understood warfare. because the humans had demonstrated that a species willing to sacrifice individual ships and crews could achieve strategic effects far beyond what their nominal military strength suggested. The Korth fleet, which had dominated this region of space for decades through superior firepower and disciplined tactics, found itself fighting an enemy that operated according to completely different rules, where losing battles could somehow contribute to winning wars through mechanisms that defied conventional analysis. Human crews continued fighting even when their ships were reduced to barely functional wrecks, using damaged vessels as improvised weapons or sensor platforms, while jury-rigging systems that should not have been able to function, creating new tactical capabilities from the debris of their own destruction. Captain Alex Thompson led boarding parties onto captured Korth vessels, with equipment that consisted mainly of personal weapons and cutting tools, yet somehow managed to seize control of ships that were designed to be defended by crews 10 times larger than his assault teams. The humans seemed to become more dangerous as their situation became more desperate, fighting with an intensity that increased rather than decreased as their losses mounted, each casualty motivating the survivors to take greater risks and attempt more ambitious objectives. What had begun as a routine conquest for the Korth Empire gradually transformed into a grinding war of attrition, where their technological advantages meant nothing against an enemy that refused to accept defeat, regardless of how hopeless their situation appeared to objective observers. Then found himself updating his reports to the Galactic Council with increasing frequency as the scope of human military capabilities became clear, but he struggled to find words that could adequately describe what he was witnessing without sounding like he had suffered some form of mental breakdown. The humans were not just winning battles they should have lost. They were redefining what victory meant in the context of interstellar warfare, proving that a species united by principles stronger than survival instinct could overcome advantages that had previously been considered insurmountable by every military theorist in the galaxy. Zixthan's reports to the Galactic Council became increasingly disturbed as he began to understand the true implications of human warfare, realizing that what he had initially dismissed as primitive aggression was actually a sophisticated military philosophy that treated surrender as a concept that simply did not exist in their vocabulary. The humans did not fight to achieve specific territorial or resource objectives like every other species in the galaxy, but rather as if the very act of resistance was more important than survival itself, creating a military force that became more dangerous rather than less effective as their situation deteriorated. Even when captured, human prisoners like Sergeant Ben Carter continued to resist their captors through methods that Zixthan's training had never prepared him to analyze, organizing escape attempts and sabotage operations that crippled Korth prison facilities. Despite the obvious impossibility of successful breakouts, Carter had been held in a maximum security detention center designed to contain the most dangerous military prisoners from dozens of different species. Yet within days of his arrival, he had somehow established communication networks among the human captives and begun planning operations that treated the prison as just another battlefield. Humans seemed incapable of recognizing when they were beaten, continuing to fight even from positions where no rational analysis could identify any possibility of achieving meaningful military objectives, as if the mere fact of being alive obligated them to keep resisting, regardless of circumstances. Then watched in fascination and growing horror as Captain Alex Thompson led boarding parties through the corridors of captured Korth vessels, fighting room by room against defenders who outnumbered them 10-1 while refusing to retreat even when their casualties mounted beyond what should have been the breaking point for any military unit. Thompson's assault teams moved through hostile ship corridors like they were conducting training exercises rather than suicide missions, using improvised weapons and tactics that turned every piece of equipment into a potential tool for violence, while coordinating their movements with precision that suggested years of practice. The most disturbing aspect of Thompson's operations was not their effectiveness, but the way his troops responded to casualties, treating each fallen comrade not as a reason for caution, but as additional motivation for revenge, their battle cries echoing through the metal passages as they called out the names of dead friends. Human military units seemed to have collective memory that transcended individual survival, with new recruits immediately adopting the grudges and motivations of veterans they had never met, creating institutional culture that treated every historical injustice as a personal affront, requiring immediate retaliation. The battle cry that echoed through human communication channels had evolved to include the names of heroes like Rodriguez and Clark, transforming individual sacrifices into rallying points that inspired entire fleets to attempt maneuvers that should have been impossible, even for crews with nothing left to lose. Then realized that human warfare operated according to psychological principles that made their forces more dangerous as they suffered losses rather than less effective, creating a positive feedback loop where defeat became a source of strength rather than weakness. The Korth Empire, which had conquered dozens of star systems through campaigns based on fear and intimidation, found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to become more motivated by threats rather than less willing to resist, responding to overwhelming force with increased aggression rather than rational submission. When Korth commanders attempted to break human morale through standard psychological warfare techniques like broadcasting casualty reports and displaying captured personnel, the humans responded by fighting harder rather than surrendering, as if the suffering of their comrades was proof that their cause was worth dying for. Human medical personnel continued treating wounded soldiers in combat zones where evacuation was impossible, often becoming casualties themselves while refusing to abandon patients who could not be moved, creating a culture where individual survival was consistently subordinated to collective welfare. Dr. Sarah Williams exemplified this phenomenon during the siege of Outpost Gamma, where she continued performing surgery in a makeshift hospital while Korth artillery bombardment gradually destroyed the building around her, saving lives that military triage protocols would have classified as unsalvageable. The humans began pushing back against Korth forces with tactics that should have been impossible given their technological disadvantage, using captured enemy equipment in ways that violated basic safety protocols while achieving results that exceeded the original design specifications. Captain Kate Murphy led fleets composed primarily of captured Korth vessels that had been retrofitted with human weapons and operated by crews who treated the sophisticated alien technology like familiar tools, despite having no formal training in their operation. What terrified Zexthon most was the realization that humans seemed to learn from every engagement regardless of whether they won or lost, analyzing enemy tactics and developing countermeasures with speed that suggested they were treating the entire war as an educational opportunity rather than a struggle for survival. The human approach to warfare violated every principle that governed conflict between rational species, creating military forces that operated according to logic that was simultaneously completely alien and devastatingly effective against enemies who understood concepts like cost-benefit analysis and acceptable losses. By the time Zexthon realized what he was truly documenting, the war had already shifted from a routine conquest to an existential crisis for the Korth Empire, whose forces were discovering that some enemies become more dangerous when they have nothing left to lose rather than more willing to negotiate. The humans were not just winning a war they should have lost. They were demonstrating that a species, unified by principles stronger than individual survival, could rewrite the fundamental rules that governed how civilizations interacted in a galaxy where military power had always been measured by technology and resources rather than determination and sacrifice. The war ended with complete human victory, but Zexthon's final report to the Galactic Council was not the simple military assessment he had been sent to provide, instead becoming a desperate warning about a species that had fundamentally changed. His understanding of what warfare could become when conducted by beings who refused to accept defeat as a possibility, Fleet Admiral Grace Murphy now commanded a combined force of human and captured Korth vessels that had been retrofitted with hybrid technology systems, creating a military capability that exceeded what either civilization could have achieved independently. But her communications with the Galactic Council carried undertones that made ZX-Thon's scales itch with primitive fear responses. Murphy's offers of peaceful diplomatic relations were accompanied by casual references to human military doctrine that revealed a species now fully aware they were not alone in the universe and had developed tactics specifically designed for fighting enemies with superior technology and numerical advantages. The humans spoke about interstellar warfare like it was a problem they had already solved, rather than a new challenge they were still learning to face, discussing strategies for defeating orbital bombardment and countering energy shield technology with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for routine maintenance schedules. Zex then realized that his months of observation had given the humans detailed intelligence about Galactic Council military capabilities and tactical doctrine, information they were undoubtedly analyzing and incorporating into their own strategic planning, even as they extended offers of friendship and cooperation. Admiral Murphy's fleet included vessels that mounted weapon systems combining human kinetic technology with Korth energy manipulation, creating hybrid weapons that could penetrate defensive systems designed to stop either type of attack individually, but not both simultaneously. The human approach to diplomacy reflected the same principles that governed their warfare, treating negotiations not as attempts to find mutually acceptable compromises, but as opportunities to establish relationships based on mutual respect between equals rather than the traditional superior-subordinate dynamic that characterized most interstellar politics when Council representatives attempted to establish the usual diplomatic protocols that acknowledged human technological inferiority and limited territorial claims. Murphy's responses made it clear that humans considered themselves equals to any civilization in the galaxy, regardless of age, technology, or historical achievements. The humans had demonstrated that species survival was not necessarily determined by technological advancement or military resources, but by willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended individual self-interest. Creating a military force that could overcome apparently insurmountable odds through sheer determination, Zetkexthen's analysis revealed that human military effectiveness was based on cultural factors that could not be replicated by other species, because they required fundamental changes in how individuals related to their civilization and their fellow beings, changes that would essentially transform any society that adopted them. The most disturbing aspect of human psychology was their apparent inability to distinguish between defensive and offensive warfare, treating any threat to their civilization or allies as justification for unlimited escalation, regardless of the original scope of the conflict. Human military doctrine included contingency plans for scenarios that other species would consider impossible, such as fighting wars across multiple star systems simultaneously while maintaining supply lines through hostile territory, using nothing but determination and improvised logistics. The humans had proven that conventional military analysis was inadequate for predicting the outcome of conflicts involving species that operated according to principles other than rational self-interest, creating strategic uncertainty that would affect every future council decision about territorial disputes and resource allocation. Zex then concluded his report with observations that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life, documenting a species that treated impossible odds not as reasons for surrender, but as personal challenges that proved their worth as individuals and as a civilization. His final recommendation to the Galactic Council was simple and absolute, stating that under no circumstances should humanity ever be considered an enemy because they represented a form of military power that could not be contained through traditional deterrence methods based on superior technology or numerical advantage. The humans did not fight for territory or resources like every other species in galactic history, but for concepts that Zexthan's translation software could only approximate as honor, loyalty, and protection of those who could not protect themselves, creating a military force motivated by principles that made them immune to conventional diplomatic pressure. They had demonstrated that some civilizations would rather face extinction than accept subjugation, treating death as preferable to surrender and transforming every member of their species into a potential weapon that could be activated by threats to their fundamental values. Exthan's personal notes included observations that he would never include in official reports, describing a species that made him question everything he understood about survival, rationality, and the basic principles that governed behavior among intelligent life forms. The humans represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization, a military force that became more dangerous when threatened rather than more willing to negotiate, creating strategic implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical considerations of any specific conflict. His final entry requested immediate reassignment to a peaceful research station as far from human space as possible, because he now understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess, and some enemies were too terrifying to study closely. Zexthan had been sent to observe human military capabilities for the Council's strategic database. But what he discovered was that humans did not fight wars in any conventional sense. They fought extinctions, treating every battle as if the survival of their entire species depended on victory regardless of the actual stakes involved.